Amanda Vanstone, welcome.
Thanks, Patricia.
Nearly 2/3 of Australians want National Cabinet to cooperate better as the country reopens from the COVID-19 crisis. Was it the right decision to move to the National Cabinet model instead of COAG?
Yeah, well, I think it was. I can understand people wanting it to work more effectively because in a national, facing a national dilemma as we do with COVID, we want everything to work perfectly. I get that. And so someone came up with a bright idea, let's get the premiers and the Prime Minister to cooperate so we work together as a nation. Great idea, give it a big tick. But what we're facing is the reality that the premiers are answerable back to their states and they're not going to forget that. And so it's a bit harder than you think. It's like pretending that you can have a Christmas dinner with a big family and by 4 o'clock there won't be an argument. Of course there'll be disagreements, but we shouldn't be worried about that and take that sort of dynamic as being bad. It's what you get in a federation.
64% of respondents said they believe the Morrison government and state and territory leaders had not collaborated well during the crisis. What do you attribute that breakdown to? Because obviously that's the impression that so many people got.
Well, people do have the impression there's a breakdown, but what they're seeing is the reality of a federation. I mean, if you spoke to Western Australians and you asked the general question, do you think National Cabinet should cooperate more effectively? I guarantee you they'll all answer yes. But if you say to Western Australians, should your Premier open the borders and put you back to being a part of Australia, they might not say that. So we say one thing and want another. And Patricia, another example of that is we say we want leaders who make long-term decisions. But come election time, everybody's there speaking to politicians about what they can get because they actually want a short-term benefit. So this McKinnon Prize actually makes people think about what they want in a leader. What is a leader? And I'm sure it's not someone who does what you and I want today. It's someone who looks to the longer term.
Do you think the pandemic has made Australians realise how much power premiers have?
It's certainly made them realise that premiers are there and that they can control their state in a variety of ways. I don't know that they didn't know that before, but it's now crystal clear to them.
And in terms of the power, I think it's revealed that the Prime Minister has perhaps less power than we thought the Prime Minister had. Do you think that's been a strong element of the pandemic, that it's demonstrated the power of the states in that context?
Well, I think it's a good thing for people to understand they live in a federation and that everything that goes wrong or right is not necessarily the Commonwealth Government's fault. I think it's about time people realise the role that states played and let the premiers and the state ministers take responsibility for their decisions. We're a bit glib or blithe in the way that we say, oh, the Commonwealth, should do something about it, when really what we mean, an appropriate level of government should do something about it. So I think it's been a good lesson for us in the reality of federation, and perhaps we'll look to our premiers more than we have in the past.
The poll showed a distinct divide between metropolitan and regional Australia when it comes to voting patterns, with those in regional or rural areas drifting away from the major parties. And we've seen this kind of trend. What did you make of that?
I don't think it's just COVID related. I think there are wider issues. But in sense of the COVID related aspect, I think it's that people in the rural areas felt much safer for a longer period of time and quite distanced from the drama that was going on in, for example, Melbourne and Sydney. In the wider context, I think people in regional Australia rightly feel as though their news feed comes out of Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, Adelaide people think that, and that's hardly, remote. You might think it's regional, but whatever. We feel as if most of our news is dictated by news desks in Sydney and Melbourne, and we don't get enough local stuff. Not enough attention is paid to us. But I suppose every state feels that.
I think that the Sydney-Melbourne centricity is kind of very real, actually, and people feel it very acutely across the country. How do you think it'll play out in the federal election, given we have not one national story when it comes to COVID and the recovery? Where you are in Adelaide, it's a completely different story to what I'm experiencing in Melbourne. We don't have a shared experience at the moment. In fact, we have quite distinctive experiences. How does that work when you're trying to run a national campaign?
Well, I'm not sure the election will be fought on COVID, and I don't know when it's going to be, but I do find it extraordinary that people are talking about, the failure of the vaccination rollout, when in fact we're already ahead of the United States in terms of primary vaccinations and well on the way to being one of the most vaccinated countries in the world. And I think what we're seeing, therefore, is focusing on decision by decision rather than the end game. Now, has everything been perfect? Of course not. With a moving feast, it never is. Who knew in the beginning that you didn't need to have the AstraZeneca vaccination as chilled or as under dry ice or something as they were trying to in the beginning? And that change made a huge opportunity for greater distribution and releasing of things because of the logistical change. So I think we judge problems on a day-to-day basis, but in the end, if we end up, as I think we're going to, one of the most vaccinated countries in the world, we will look back and say, gee, we did pretty well.
Who has shown the best leadership during the pandemic?
I don't know that I'm in a position to judge that, and certainly as an ambassador for the McKinnon Prize, even if I were, I wouldn't offer. You rightly identify that the premiers have got their own responsibilities and they lead in different ways. I think the McKinnon Prize invites us to consider what we think we want in a leader. I've already covered the fact that we say we want, someone who looks to the future, and we really want someone who acts for the present. We say we don't want self-interested people, but we're self-interested ourselves. So I think it gives us opportunity to reflect on ourselves and also to consider the good parliamentarians that are there. I'm not making the case that there aren't any duds. Look, there are duds in the medical profession, in the police force, in every field. Of course there are. But what that means is the duds get all the coverage, and the good parliamentarians who work really hard, try and service their electorates or their ministries, hardly get a look in because they're boring. They're not colour, conflict or controversy. And we need to pay attention to the good people and give them a bit of sunlight, because if we only focus on the bad stuff, you put off good people going into Parliament, you make good people who are there jaded, and you certainly say to the public, no one decent is in Parliament if you don't cover the decent people. And that erodes trust in our institutions. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather live in a country where you can have the Prime Minister on and have a go at him than in another country where if you have a go at the Prime Minister privately, you might disappear the next day. Then we've got to value that and understand what it means to value it.
Just finally, the government's climate change policy is currently being debated, as you know. When you talk about good leadership, I suppose future is pretty much key there, isn't it? Given we're having a debate about net zero emissions by 2050, that seems like very far into the future, yet it's a reality that we're grappling with in terms of leadership. I would love to hear your take on how this is currently being managed. I mean, we're still having climate wars, it seems, in the coalition. Are you finding that frustrating to watch?
Well, I think you used the right word, manage. Good leaders don't make announcements for the top and expect everybody to follow. If I racked my brain, I could come up with examples of people who weren't leaders the next day because they thought they could just dictate. First among many is one way of describing it. People do have different views. You have to listen to them, and it's often hellishingly hard to manage that. Really hard. But that's a leader's job, and that's what Morrison's doing. It of course is frustrating. It must be frustrating as hell for him and for the people who have a different view, who want their view taken into account. But, we wouldn't order a cup of tea the same way. I'm not sure if you and I went into a bar, Patricia, we'd order the same drink. So how do we expect, 150 people coming together to have exactly the same view? They don't, and we have to manage it. It's as simple as that. Why we expect this magic bullet of, I've got a sentence and you'll all agree with it, I don't know. Because magic bullets, they're called magic because they don't exist. No,
but as you say, the McKinnon Prize for Political Leadership is about that kind of vision, being able to step out.
Yes.
What does that look like in the current context?
Well, I think let's wait and see the end point. The process is often ugly, of making a casserole, but it might taste pretty good at the end. So let's wait and see. The process is often ugly.
All right, ugly process, maybe a good casserole at the end, hopefully. Amanda, thank you.
Thanks, Patricia.